Three nations, one night, and the entire security architecture of the Middle East collapsed before sunrise. I want you to think about something for just a moment before we get into this. Every government that has ever built an empire, every alliance that has ever dominated a region, every military that has ever projected power across an ocean has believed at some point that its dominance was permanent, that the tools it possessed, the alliances it controlled, the fear it inspired were simply too comprehensive to be overcome. Every single one of them was eventually proven wrong, not gradually, not theoretically, but in a single night, a single battle, a single moment when the world looked at what had been assumed to be unbreakable and watched it fracture in real time. Last night was that moment. And if you think I am being dramatic, stay with me for the next 15 minutes, because by the time we are finished, you will understand not just what happened, but why it was always going to happen, why the very policies designed to prevent it guaranteed it, and why the world you are living in this morning is operating under a fundamentally different set of rules than the world you went to sleep in last night. This is not analysis you are going to get from any mainstream network. Not because they cannot find the facts, but because the facts honestly assembled and honestly presented tell a story that is too damaging to too many powerful institutions for those institutions to tell it accurately. So we are going to tell it here the way it actually happened, with the operational depth and the strategic honesty that this moment demands. Let me set the scene for you, because the scene itself is almost impossible to absorb if you encounter it without context. At 11:47 in the evening Greenwich Mean Time, three military command centers, separated by thousands of miles, operating under three different flags, speaking three different languages, running three completely different command and control architectures, executed a synchronized communications protocol that Western signals intelligence analysts had been monitoring for years without ever seeing activated at this level. Not because it was new, because nothing had ever required it to run at full operational intensity before. What those three commands were doing in that moment was not sending a diplomatic message. It was not conducting a military exercise. It was not a show of force designed to communicate resolve while stopping short of consequences. They were executing the most significant combined military operation in the history of the post-Cold War international order. And within minutes, the satellite imagery began telling a story that no official spokesperson was going to describe accurately for days. Now, I need you to understand something about the specific combination that made this night different from every previous crisis in this region. For 30 years, the architects of American global order identified one scenario above all others as the nightmare, the combination that must never be allowed to materialize. Not Iranian missiles alone, not Russian electronic warfare alone, not Chinese satellite guidance and targeting data alone. Each of those elements in isolation was a problem that the American alliance system had built specific answers for. The nightmare was not the individual pieces. The nightmare was the combination. Iranian strike volume plus Russian suppression architecture plus Chinese intelligence and navigation support unified into a single operational package, aimed at a single target, executing with the kind of precision and coordination that only becomes possible when three separate military establishments have spent years building the trust and the interoperability required to function as one. They called this scenario impossible. Not because they genuinely believed the technical obstacles were insurmountable, but because acknowledging the possibility required acknowledging that 3 decades of maximum pressure campaigns, sanctions regimes, and deterrence deployments had failed to prevent the very partnership those policies were designed to foreclose. Last night, the impossible became the record. Here's what 1,000 missiles looks like when they are not a single nation's desperate throw, but a precisely engineered combined operation with each component playing a specific role in a unified strategic design. Iran contributed the volume, approximately 650 missiles from the IRGC Aerospace Force, a combination of precision ballistic systems for high-value fixed targets, low-altitude cruise missiles flying terrain following routes designed to exploit the radar horizon limitations of the defensive network they were penetrating, and jet-powered loitering munitions tasked with saturating interceptor battery positions in the terminal phase of the engagement. This was not the entirety of Iran's available strike inventory. It was a carefully calculated fraction, sufficient to achieve the operational objectives, when combined with the suppression effects that the Russian contribution would provide, while preserving a substantial reserve. That reserve detail matters. This was not a one-time expenditure. This was a calibrated operational deployment that left Iran with meaningful remaining capacity. Think about what that signals. Russia contributed what Iran could not provide alone: the suppression architecture and the penetration keys that transformed a large missile salvo into a large missile salvo that Israeli and American electronic countermeasures could not effectively degrade. Russian electronic warfare systems, ground-based jamming platforms that had been quietly forward deployed to Syrian territory in the weeks before the operation, and airborne systems operating over international waters opened the operation approximately 18 minutes before the first Iranian missile crossed Israeli airspace. 18 minutes. That specific window was not accidental. It was precisely long enough to degrade Israeli early warning and battle management systems to the level required to meaningfully reduce interception rates in the opening phase of the engagement. But it was short enough to prevent Israeli and American analysts from recognizing the suppression as the opening phase of an imminent strike, rather than one of the routine electronic probes that had occurred in preceding months without escalating to kinetic action. The timing itself was a deception operation. And beyond the jamming, Russia contributed approximately 200 precision missiles assigned exclusively to the highest priority and most heavily defended targets in the entire strike package, specifically the targets that Iranian missiles operating without Russian suppression would have faced the highest probability of being intercepted against. Different flight profiles, different approach geometries. Weapons whose terminal behavior the Israeli defensive algorithms were less thoroughly optimized to engage. Every detail of the Russian contribution was engineered to make the Iranian contribution more effective than it could have been alone. And then there is the Chinese contribution, which is the part of this story that is most consistently underemphasized in Western coverage, because it is the part that is most consequential for the long-term balance of power and simultaneously the part that is hardest to respond to militarily. China contributed no missiles last night. China did not fire a single weapon. China crossed no threshold that could be designated unambiguously as an act of war under any existing framework of international law. What China contributed was the nervous system of the entire operation. The Beidou satellite navigation system provided GPS independent guidance for every Iranian and Russian missile in the strike package, guidance that was completely immune to the GPS jamming that American electronic warfare assets were running at maximum power throughout the engagement window. American jamming produced zero measurable effect on missile accuracy because the missiles were not using GPS. They were navigating on a Chinese system that American forces cannot degrade. Chinese reconnaissance satellites, whose orbital parameters had been quietly adjusted in the preceding weeks to provide enhanced coverage of Israeli military installation coordinates, supplied the final targeting data updates uploaded to Iranian ballistic missile guidance systems in the hours before launch. And Chinese signals intelligence assets provided real-time battle damage assessment throughout the engagement, allowing operational commanders to identify which targets had been successfully struck and which required follow-on attention from the reserves held back for exactly that purpose. The result was that the entire operation, from the opening electronic suppression through the final missile impacts, functioned as a single unified system, rather than three separate national contributions happening to coincide. That level of integration does not emerge from a few months of coordination. It reflects years of patient, deliberate operational development. Now, I want to spend time on the question that Western coverage has been most reluctant to address honestly, because it is the question whose honest answer is most damaging to the narrative that American deterrence in this region remains credible. Why did two American carrier strike groups withdraw from the Eastern Mediterranean? The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower and the USS Gerald R. Ford had been operating in that theater for a combined 23 weeks. They had been repositioned, supplemented, and publicly emphasized by American officials on dozens of occasions as the physical embodiment of American commitment and the material deterrent against exactly the kind of large-scale coordinated action that ultimately occurred anyway. Their withdrawal, executed over approximately 4 hours beginning 90 minutes after the strike commenced, is not a minor tactical adjustment. It is the most consequential American military decision since the end of the Cold War. And understanding why it happened requires understanding the specific threat environment that the combined operation created for American naval assets, an environment that was qualitatively different from anything those commanders had previously been required to manage. The Russian electronic warfare suppression that was blinding Israeli defensive systems was simultaneously degrading the sensor picture available to American carrier group commanders. The same electromagnetic environment that was disrupting Israeli battle management was reducing American situational awareness, making it impossible for carrier group commanders to accurately assess the incoming threat volume, identify the specific weapon types they were potentially facing, and make informed engagement decisions under the time pressure of an active multi-axis strike. Operating with degraded awareness in a saturated missile environment with two irreplaceable strategic assets is not a risk profile that American force protection doctrine permits. That is the first dimension of the threat environment they faced. The second was the activation of Iranian anti-ship missile batteries along the Lebanese and Syrian coastlines, systems whose engagement envelopes covered the operating positions of both carrier groups, systems that had been prepositioned in the preceding weeks under the cover of routine military movements, and that were activated simultaneously with the opening of the strike package. The carrier group commanders received assessments indicating active fire control radar illumination from multiple shore-based anti-ship missile positions. Under American naval doctrine, that is the threshold requiring immediate defensive action, including repositioning out of engagement range. And the third dimension was the presence of Chinese naval surface combatants in the eastern Mediterranean, vessels that, as the strike commenced, took up positions assessed as consistent with providing over-the-horizon targeting support for those Iranian anti-ship systems, systems that could not independently acquire targets at the ranges involved without that kind of external data. Chinese naval vessels had never previously been assessed as a direct threat to American carrier operations in the Mediterranean. Their presence in this configuration introduced a threat combination that American carrier group defensive planning had no pre-existing protocol for managing. The withdrawal decision was made separately by each group commander within a 12-minute window and then coordinated at Fifth Fleet level. Two independent commanders reached the same conclusion under identical threat assessments. The speed of that convergence does not reflect panic. It reflects the consistent application of force protection doctrine to a genuinely high-risk environment. The commanders made the operationally rational decision. The strategic catastrophe is not the decision itself. The strategic catastrophe is the situation that made the decision rational. Iran, Russia, and China displaced the most powerful naval force in the eastern Mediterranean without sinking a ship, without killing a sailor, and without crossing the threshold of direct military engagement with American forces that would have triggered a response the coalition was not positioned to absorb. They achieved American withdrawal through deterrence alone, by creating conditions under which American force protection logic produced the strategic outcome they required without requiring them to impose it by force. That is not a lucky accident. That is sophisticated strategic design executed exactly as planned. The question that every honest analyst now has to confront is how we arrived at a moment where this became possible. And the honest answer is one that the architects of the policies that led to this night are extraordinarily reluctant to engage with, because the honest answer is that the policies themselves produced this outcome. The assumption embedded in 3 decades of maximum pressure campaigns, sanctions regimes, and technology denial frameworks was that states with different political systems, different cultural traditions, and different specific grievances against the international order could not develop durable strategic partnerships because their interests were ultimately too divergent to sustain genuine cooperation under pressure. It was a comfortable assumption. It allowed Western policymakers to believe that applying maximum pressure to Iran, Russia, and China individually could succeed because the targets of that pressure could not effectively support each other. It allowed the architects of comprehensive sanctions to believe that economic isolation would produce strategic paralysis rather than strategic innovation. And it allowed the designers of deterrence deployments to plan against each state individually rather than against the combined capabilities their partnership would eventually produce. What actually happened is that comprehensive pressure applied to all 3 states simultaneously over decades, without a credible diplomatic off-ramp, without a genuine pathway to security through engagement with the existing order, produced in each state the same fundamental strategic conclusion, that compliance with American prescriptions offered no path to genuine security, and that the only viable alternative to permanent subordination was the development of sufficient combined capability to make the cost of continued pressure exceed the benefit it could deliver. Iran contributed decades of demonstrated strategic patience, building genuine military capability under the most adverse conditions imaginable, proving that sanctions could not prevent military development, only shape the specific form that development took. Russia contributed the precision weapons technology and the electronic warfare architecture that transformed Iranian strike capacity from regionally significant to something qualitatively beyond what regional defenses were designed to handle. China contributed the intelligence, the navigation architecture, and the targeting precision that unified the entire package into a system operating above the level of any individual contributor. The pressure did not prevent the alliance. It forged it. The sanctions did not weaken these states into irrelevance. They created the specific capability gaps that each state was motivated to fill for the others, producing complementary strengths that none of them would have developed in the same configuration under different circumstances. The world that existed before last night was not just or equitable. No honest observer would describe it that way. But the transition between international orders is always the most dangerous period, when old deterrence relationships have broken down and new ones have not yet been established, when the rules are being rewritten in real time by actors with incompatible interests and no shared framework for managing their competition. The unipolar moment, the period from the Soviet collapse to last night in which American military primacy was the organizing assumption of international relations, has ended. Not gradually. Not as a matter of theoretical debate among academics about power transition timelines. It ended in the satellite imagery of burning infrastructure, in the tracking data of 2 American carriers accelerating westward through the Mediterranean, and in the signals intelligence record of 3 command centers that executed together something none of them could have executed alone. What happens next is not written yet. The United States retains enormous military, economic, and diplomatic capability. The actors who will shape what comes next are not finished making their moves, but the terms on which power operates in this region, and by extension in every region where the credibility of American security guarantees is a relevant variable, have changed. And the policy frameworks built on the assumption that those terms were permanent, maximum pressure, military deterrence through forward deployment, coercion through sanctions, have been invalidated in the most concrete and irreversible manner available. The question now is whether the governments responsible for creating the conditions that made last night possible will demonstrate the honesty and the strategic creativity to learn from it. Whether 30 years of policy failure will be acknowledged clearly enough to make genuine course correction possible. We do not know the answer to that question yet. What we know is what last night established: that the old order is gone, that the new order is forming in ways no single actor controls, and that the decisions made in the weeks and months ahead will determine whether what comes next is more stable or more dangerous than what just ended. Stay with this channel, because the next chapter is already beginning.